I'd like to give a little disclaimer. There are a lot of people that fit the term old China hand, and I'm not one of those. I know a lot of those people, and I've spent some time with them, and I've got some hands-on experience, but my parents weren't missionaries in China, and I didn't grow up there. And actually, the only Chinese, I can speak a little bit of Mandarin, but the one that rings a bell is Lianga Pijo, which means one beer, please. So that's something you can take away. If you get nothing else out of tonight, you can remember that. The title of the presentation is The Way Ahead with China. And it's a little bit of a misnomer because that's a prediction. And what I'm going to try to narrow this down to is having a recommendation for a way ahead with China, but it's very hard to figure that out these days. There's so many things going on. And Yogi Berra talked about predictions being hard because they're about the future, and the way ahead with China is very difficult to figure out too. As I look around to the few people we have in the room here and the people that may be watching, John and I haven't been wearing masks, and we're not. It's not that we're trying to make any sort of statement at all about that. We've got a large room. It's well ventilated. There are very few people in it, and so we feel safe being without masks tonight. But you should be wearing yours, but not if you're at home. Now, the objective that I've got tonight is to try to narrow the scope down about thinking about China, and really, rather than talk a whole lot about current events, though we'll get to some of that later on, to give a context and a perspective on how to think about things with China, how to understand where some of the things that pop up daily, if you can figure out whether they're true or not, then put them into context, and we'll try to look at that. And then I will posit a framework for how to think about China, and then share a few experiences that we've had. Suzanne, my wife, is here. We shared a lot of them together, and some of the ones I'm going to talk about, she wasn't there for those, but she was on the sides and urging a rapid solution to many problems that we had. And then I'm going to propose some steps that we can use in the current environment and what's going on with the change of administrations here. We'll talk a little bit about that. But for what we're talking about now, for the note takers in the group, I've got 4 things that you might want to consider. One is to look at the CIA fact book. It's online. There's a 2021 version of it. It's very good. That's got facts about every country in the world, a lot about China, a lot of detail, and it's about as accurate as you can get. There are another couple of articles. There's one in the Foreign Affairs Quarterly that the Council on Foreign Relations puts out by Kevin Rudd, who is the ambassador to Australia, he was the Prime Minister of Australia, and he writes an article called Short of War. It's a long article, but it's quite good about how the U.S. and China, how things may turn out, and put some perspective there too. There's a second one in the Foreign Affairs Quarterly that's written by Jake Sullivan, who is now President Biden's National Security Advisor. Jake Sullivan's a pretty young guy. He's about 40, extremely talented, very good, and a very strong player. And it's co-authored by Kurt Campbell, who is also a very smart person and worked in government for a long time. And their article is called Compete and Coexist, or Confront and Co-Destroy. That's a sort of a ominous title, but it's a very good article, and there are a lot of things to think about in both of those pieces. And then the last one is the classic, to read Sun Tzu, the book called The Art of War. And if you read Sun Tzu and read it and study it, it gives you a lot of insight on how the Chinese think about things. He's notable for saying a general, which he was, is a servant of the state, And he talks about the ultimate skill of a general or a servant of the state is to win objectives. It might be a war, but to win the objectives without going to war, because wars are too costly. And so you can think about that as to how you put things in place to get your desired goal without going to war. So, what are some facts about China? This is just a little bit of geographical background, demographic background. China is about the size of the United States. The U.S. is one of the larger countries. China is about number 4. We're about the same size. China has 1.4 billion people. That's about 20% of the people in the world. It's 4 to 1, but the U.S. has about 330 million, so they've got 4 people for every one we have. And if you think about population density, if you put all of the people in the United States and put them all east of the Mississippi River, that's about the population density that China has. But of course, they're not spread out homogenously like they're not in the United States either. Most of the population in China is along the coastline, and about the preponderance of it is, and they're moving more and more people to the cities out of the country as they prosper business-wise. The mantra in China with 1.4 billion people is if you've got a large GDP, which they have, that if you divide it by 1.4 billion people, it's very small per capita-wise. If you've got a problem, and it's not really a big problem, but you multiply it by 1.4 billion, it becomes a very big problem. And they think about things that way. It's kind of cute, but it's true as well. The Chinese have a 96% literacy rate. And I'll talk about something in a story a little bit later on where Jiang Zemin talked about the number of Chinese that speak English, which is more than the population of the United States. Interesting tidbit. They have 11% of the arable land, and think of that, not 11% of their land is arable land, and they're trying to support 20% of the world's population with that. So they've got to import some stuff, but they do grow a lot of things as well. Demographically, they're aging very fast. And so if you think of how they've done and how they've progressed, one, they've had a huge workforce that has been young, and they've been low paid, and they've helped China get where they are since 1978 when they started to open up a bit. But that population is aging fast, and it's owing to the fact that they went for about 30 years with the one-child policy, which has been amended now where it's not as rigorous as it was. And they also have a very low birth rate, owing to the fact that the young people that come along from the one-child policy aren't having very many children. So in the next 15 years, the age of people in China over 65 years old will double. So that's a problem for them. We have a similar problem, but not to the extent that they do, and how they're going to care for all those people. So that demography is something they have to think about. The other part, and I'll talk some more about this later, but China's 6,000 years old. You know, they've been a little over that. They've been in business for 6,000 years. We've been in business for about 245 years, since 1776. And so Henry Kissinger had a throwaway line, maybe there's something we could learn from them. And that's probably true. There is something we can learn from them. But it doesn't reduce some of the frictions we have. So let's talk and shift now, having talked about some stuff about China. What are some ways to look at it, and how do we evaluate and look at the way forward with China? And I have to back off a little bit here. I'm going to talk largely on a bilateral basis tonight. U.S. China, U.S. China. There are a lot of other countries that are very important in the world that affect this relationship. They affect our relationships with them. But I'm going to talk primarily about our bilateral relationship tonight. And so the words I'd like to put in your mind is to think of the way with China as a protracted negotiation. It's what we think about. It's going on forever. You don't solve it too much. You manage things. You try to work it out. And another word that other people are using now is a managed strategic competition. That's sort of saying the same thing, but it's a protracted negotiation. And now for those of you we all negotiate things in our families. You buy a set of tires as a negotiation, you do. But in some complex negotiations where you're sitting down and trying to work out a thorny issue, the things to think about that we don't always do are you need to think through and be very certain of what are the things the entity you represent, what do you want to get out of this negotiation, and what do you need to get out of this negotiation? Some things that you'd like to get, but they're a little softer, but then there's some hard things that you need to get out of it. The second part that you have to think about that's even more difficult is what is the other side, the other entity with whom you're negotiating, what do they want to get out of it, and what do they need to get out of it? And that implies that you have a good enough intelligence to know what's important to them. And I can remember a time happened to be riding to Australia on an airplane with Bill Clinton, and his staff was telling him, got to do this, got to do that, this is what you're going to do when you get there. And he made the comment, yeah, that's nice, but in this case it was John Howard, it wasn't Kevin Rudd that was the Prime Minister of Australia. He can't deliver that. So it's important to know what the other person you're arguing with or with whom you're negotiating, what they can and can't do, what they can bring out to the table. So there are 4 points really here, and the third one is this a long-term negotiation or a short-term one? And in general, a short-term negotiation, I talked about buying a set of tires, or if you're driving across the country and you need to buy a new car in Kansas City, you get the best deal that you can. You're never going to go there again, and you work that, and it's a short-term negotiation. You get it and you go. The long-term negotiation, when you're negotiating with someone and there's someone you want to deal with in the future, you have a different tack that you take in the negotiation because you've got to give some to get some so that you don't, trump yourself for down the road so that you can't you have a relationship that's screwed up if you just play too much hardball early on, so you have to do that in the negotiation as well. And then the other thing about thinking about the protracted negotiation with China and managing things, there's a lot of stuff you can't just solve. You can't do it that way. You've got to manage it, and you work it and you work it and work it, and and that's what the negotiation with China is going to be. It's going to be one of managing things where we have differences of opinion and ways to go on that. Henry Kissinger talked about a lot of things, but he mentioned a couple of things. He said, one, you've got to understand, not everybody thinks like we do. You can't just apply your own thought process, look at people through your own prism. The Chinese think differently than we do. And they have a reputation for thinking long term, but really, again, Kissinger said, in the U.S., we like to have things tidy. We've got a problem, we like to get at it, we like to solve the problem, we like to tie a bow around it, and put it aside. That's done. Now let's get on to the next one. And the Chinese mode is not that type of thought. Their type of thought is, okay, we'll solve this, we'll be able to go forward and take some steps, but within this solution lie the seeds of the next conflict we're going to have. We'll solve this problem, but we'll create another one that's going to happen. And usually when you think about these long, complicated relationships like that, that's the way it goes. So that's something to think about. So for tonight, the notion of a protracted negotiation is one thing, is a good way to think about this stuff that keeps coming up with China. The second thing that for most of us, when we think Chinese, you think of Jesse Helms, a senator from North Carolina that didn't care for the Chinese too much, and he always talked about the red Chinese. Don't think about them so much as communist as think about them as Chinese. They are much more Chinese than they are communist. They've been Chinese for 6,000 years. They've been communist for 75 years. So it's just it's sort of a twinkling of an eye they're being communist. However, they have been authoritarian or autocratic for most of that 6,000 years. They had strong emperors for most of the time, and now they've got the General Secretary of the Communist Party, who's now Xi Jinping, who is a very authoritarian figure, and they've been that way. But they're not driven by a communist ideology. They're driven by the idea that the way that we can run this country is an authoritarian way. And so they've also got a very proud history. They think a lot of themselves. We think a lot of ourselves too, but they have, if you go to Shanghai, for example, and you go to a museum there, they've got antique bronzes that were made 2,300 years before Christ. So they've been doing metal work and doing things a long time before we were around. And they've got art that's from that area. Now, because I was a Navy guy, I've got to bring up Zheng He, who was a Chinese admiral. And Zheng He sailed out of Qingdao. And we'll talk about Qingdao a little more later, too. But Zheng He was an admiral. He also happened to be a eunuch, but he identified as a eunuch, I guess. But I better get off that topic. Anyhow, he took a fleet of ships in 1542, before Columbus discovered America, a fleet of 60 ships, the largest of which was 100 meters long, which is 3 times the size of Columbus's Santa Maria, and sailed from Qingdao through the Malacca Straits, across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar and back, doing the spice trade in those days. When he brought the fleet back to Qingdao, the emperor at that time directed him to burn the fleet, and they burned all the ships. And that was the start of a time when China withdrew from around the mid-1500s until around the end of World War II. For 500 years, they withdrew largely because they thought they had it right, and if they didn't want to get soiled by having other people come into China. So they withdrew and were very inward-looking for a long time. So that impacts them also, but they've done a lot of things. And the next thing, and really the important thing to understand about the Chinese, starts in about 1800, which the Chinese refer to as their period of humiliation. It's when they withdrew, they got very weak. And so we had they had what were called concessions, where a lot of European nations and the United States moved in and took a chunk of real estate in China and were there and stayed there for many years, and the Chinese were too weak to do anything about it. And so I said I was going to get back to Qingdao. The Germans happened to be in Qingdao, and that's why you have Qingdao beer, and it's so good all the time. And that's one of the outputs of the period of humiliation. But that period lasted from 1800 to the end of World War II, when the Japanese left. And the Japanese invaded China in 1936. And so what happened then is the United States did, in fact, two people, Ted Stevens, a senator from Alaska, flew over the hump and supplied the Chinese during World War II. And in the mid-1940s, John Glenn, another senator, an astronaut, was a Marine pilot then, and he flew out of China and helped drive the Japanese out of China, flying from there. So we weren't always had that tension with China. We were kind of working with them for that period of time. So, but then after World War II, the United States was on a ascendancy, and China went through a period under Mao Zedong where Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek in China conflicted, and Mao drove Chiang Kai-shek off to Taiwan, which leaves the Taiwan issue that we'll also talk briefly about a little more. And Mao Zedong then went through, he has a reputation now in China of being a great revolutionary, but not such a great leader. But they went through the period of the Great Leap Forward, which was 1953 to 56, which the estimates of 15 to 55 million Chinese died of starvation. And that didn't work out too well for them. And then later on, after from 1966 to 1976, they had the Cultural Revolution, which was a period of the Red Guards. They shattered all their antiques, or most of them. They drove people to the countryside, and Xi Jinping is a child of that Cultural Revolution that occurred, and they came out of that in 76, 78, along in there, when Deng Xiaoping took over from Mao Zedong, and Deng Xiaoping sort of really turned China around and said, it's okay to make money. He cut loose the enthusiasm of the Chinese people, and they started to do well. So really, what they've done in progress has happened all since 1978. The economic progress in China becoming a great power has all happened since 1978. So, given these things, why is there so much tension now between the United States and China? Why can't we just get along? That type of thought. Well, what I'd like to do is tell two stories to illustrate some of that, why we can't just get along. But the first one has to do with Jiang Zemin, who was the president of China for 13 years. Here he was the president of China for 1.3 billion people for 13 years. And he stood down in about 2003 from being president. But the story I want to tell you occurred when he came to Hawaii for his first visit as president of China. He came his first visit to the United States. And frequently leaders would like to go to Hawaii, and others do, because they don't really feel like China's exactly going to the United States. They're not going to, pay obeisance to the United States, so they come to Hawaii first. There may be other reasons they come to Hawaii first too, that we lived there 3 years. There's some good reasons to be there. So, but he came, and to give a little preamble to that, I had met him in Beijing in 1996, and it followed on to a time when we had what we call the Taiwan Straits crisis, which probably most of you all don't remember, but I remember it really well because it happened 6 weeks after I took over CINCPAC. And so it was, China had said they were going to shoot 12 missiles into Taiwan to try to influence the Taiwanese election that was going to occur on the 22nd of March. These dates aren't important. And so we reacted to that, and that's a separate topic that I could go on for a long time and bore the hell out of you for a bit. But we reacted to that, but we did it in a measured way so that the Chinese knew we could have done more because we were going to support Taiwan. We had an obligation to Taiwan. We thought a lot about how we were going to react to this. And as CINCPAC, our staff, we proposed a thing to Bill Perry, who was Secretary of Defense, who took it to President Clinton, and we briefed him on it. And we did some things with ships and planes and forces, and we wanted to, one, signal the Chinese that this was not a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. The other was to make sure that Taiwan knew that this wasn't a blank check for them. The third group we were trying to signal to were the U.S. allies in Asia, that we would honor our obligations. And the last one was the people of the United States, so that the president would have something to say to them, and that we were up, their military and the United States was doing what it was supposed to be doing. And so we monitored that, and we did it in a measured way. And as a result of that, later on in '96, there's an election, and President Clinton didn't want to send anybody associated with the political parties to China, so he asked me to go, and I said yes. But so I went there and met Jiang Zemin, did a lot of things there, and it worked out. It worked out okay. So fast forward to '97, Jiang is coming through Hawaii. CINCPAC was his host, and he came and flew in a commercial airplane, and we met him at the airport and took him on a barge, a nice Navy boat, into Pearl Harbor. And as it happened, we had 23 nuclear submarines in port that day for him to look at. And they burned up all their film before the day even got started. But Jiang and I had gotten along okay in Beijing. And escorting him, I had the temerity to ask him, had they ever considered democracy for China? And he said, yes, we consider it if we thought it had a prayer of working, but we need a more authoritarian government than that. He was very nice, for that part of the conversation. A little later on, and as a result of this 1996 crisis, CINCPAC, the job I had there, had the ability to talk to all the military leaders of all the nations in Asia. And we did it routinely, but not the PLA. We didn't have any communications with the PLA. And so in trying to work out this thing that happened in '96, I said, we need to fix that. We need to have something with the PLA. So when we were on this barge, we were steaming around Pearl Harbor. Jiang Zemin came up, and he spoke English. He stuck his finger in my chest and said, what are you trying to do with the PLA? And I said, well, Mr. President, what we're trying to do is build some trust so that we don't miscalculate and create problems for you and President Clinton. And he thought for a moment, and then he came back with the point of what I'm saying right now. He said, before there can be trust, there must be understanding. not necessarily agreement, but understanding of the other person's point of view. And before that, there has to be communications. And he said, and I've taken that aboard is I use CUT, communications, understanding, and trust. And when you think about it, most issues you deal with, this is very true. And this impacts the way we go forward with China. We must not break down and we must communicate with them. We need to understand what's driving them. We don't have to agree with it, but you can still, even if you don't agree, you can still build up little pockets of trust. And I would have to say with us in China, there are pockets of trust that are individual relationships and stuff, but there's not trust on a national level for sure. The second story I want to tell is to understand a little bit about the tension between the United States and China. Occurred up in Shenyang, which is up in the northern part of China. It was a cold day. We were up there, and we were shuffling around, waiting to get on an airplane to go back to Beijing. And a very slight Chinese guy came up and tried to get into our crowd and said, I would like to ask the ambassador a question. And so people tried to shun him away, but I said, see what he has to say. And he said, I'm a doctoral student, and I'm writing a thesis on the difference between manifest destiny in the United States and the Middle Kingdom, our version of what China is. And I thought that was a super question, and I think that question is a metaphor for what creates tension between our two countries, one of the things. And part of it has to do, we're both pretty proud of ourselves. You know, we both think we've got a system that's the best, and we're very proud of it, and the systems aren't the same. And so in the United States, manifest destiny occurred in the late 1800s. The idea that the United States was exceptional, that it was well blessed, and that if only everybody could have what we had, wouldn't the world be a better place? And so we tried to export democracy to other countries, and not everybody wanted to have it. So that was the period, particularly after World War II, when other countries were down and our country was strong. We were eager to export it, and we didn't always acknowledge that other countries couldn't sustain it. Democracy, in my opinion, is not always best for countries at various stages of development. I like it for us, and I think it's a great way, but we should not be too confident that it's good for everybody all the time. But, you know, we were proud. We have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and it's an experiment. And Abraham Lincoln said, which tried to say, can it long endure? And so it's not a given that it's going to endure. We have to work to make it do that. Now, the Chinese, on the other hand, we've talked almost ad nauseum about how they're 6,000 years old. But they had a printing press a century before Gutenberg invented the printing press in Germany. And I went in high school, I learned the Gutenberg press was the first printing press in the world, but in fact, the Chinese had that long before. The period of humiliation we talked about, talked about Zheng He and how they withdrew after that period. And so what they see themselves now is this idea of the with the culture they've had for 6,000 years. They've done a bunch of wonderful things. They try to have the idea of coming back, returning, resurging to their rightful place in the world. And this is something that they take aboard. And so we can have a fulsome discussion, which we'll try not to get into tonight, about what's the most effective way to govern in the world. And I'd say it varies from time to time. But the Chinese, in addition to having an authoritarian government, do not have a functioning judicial system. Their business and everything works on relationships rather than the rule of law. And so where we come in with a flotilla of lawyers, excuse me, Mike, a flotilla of lawyers to try to solve a problem, they say, let's have a cup of tea, let's get to know each other, see if I trust you. And they've done, billions of dollars worth of business on a handshake without a written document to support it. So they're just, it's amazing what they've had to do, and they've also had as I pointed out before, a huge working population, and they have a work ethic that just won't quit. I mean, as a military guy, I wasn't so worried about their military. But I was pretty sure the Chinese would be able to outwork us, because they work very hard, and they do that. And they have a very strong central authority. So we have two powerful nations. Both of them think their way is the best way. They both think they deserve to be where they are. And so I think this idea of the notion of the manifest destiny in the United States and the Middle Kingdom, the notion of the Middle Kingdom, just the mindset of it, is a good metaphor for why these tensions continue to exist between China. Now, I'm going to shift gears now and try to do a quick version of talking a little bit about how the Chinese system works. In China, the party, the Chinese Communist Party, is paramount. A person's stature in the country depends on their status in the party, not whatever else they do. That's what they do in the party. Now, there are about 90 million of the 1.4 billion Chinese that are members of the Communist Party. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, which includes the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, their version of the Marine Corps, reports to the party. Xi Jinping is the head of the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He's also the chairman of the military committee, Xi Jinping. The Politburo is 25 leaders, and then there's a standing committee, which is sort of like an executive committee. Xi Jinping is the head of that too. There's the National People's Congress, which is the governing, sort of a governing body. Xi Jinping is the head of that too. So the more they think about it, he covers all those bets. He does them. He's got some more titles, but he has them all. And if you think about how that works in China, the party designates the mayors of every city, the governors of every state, the CEOs of the big corporations, and the political bosses in the various things, the head of the military, the head of the People's Armed Police, which is another 2 million people in China, the bankers, just all of them. And they are designated by the party, and they are party members. And so when you think about that, that's not how we work at all. But that's how the party is so centralized in their managing. And the relationships that I talked about, the relationships they have, they work mostly. Now, Xi Jinping has he's been there since 2013. Between Jiang Zemin that we've talked about from 2003 to 2013 was Hu Jintao, who was a milder-mannered president of China. And then Xi Jinping has consolidated power. They've passed a law that he doesn't have a 10-year tenure. He's got tenure for life. And he's consolidated a lot of power, gotten rid of people that would contest him for power in the country. So that's how they work. That's how the system works in China. They're very, I use the word authoritarian rather than autocratic, but autocratic is not far off of what goes on there. Okay, what are some of the challenges that we have? China has challenges. We've talked about the demographic challenge. They have a big lack of water. They've got a lot of water in the south and a lot of people in the north. They drain the aquifers so that they have subsidence subsidence underneath Shanghai and Qingdao. They've settled about 6 or 8 inches. It's not just sea level rise. They have subsidence also there. 7% of their rivers, only 7% are suitable owing to pollution to be suitable for even for irrigation. They about the arable land, and they're also, as China becomes more sophisticated, their dependence on sea lanes and other things make them more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable to cyber attacks and things like that. And in the U.S., what are some of the challenges we have? I would say one of our biggest ones is complacency. You know, we've, in naval aviation, we also used to say complacency kills. And, you know, if you take your eye off the ball, if you think you've got it okay and you can coast a little bit, that's where things go bad. We've got a burgeoning debt. Our government functions are not so efficient right now. They're not. I'm going to run out of time. Think about the protracted negotiation. That's a good way to think about what we're doing as we go on and go forward with China. And so let's look at some suggestions. One suggested by many to lead it that is close and a small group model of what we had China in place. Stay open. Other notions that you and in Europe, for example, they, particularly the small nations, care a lot less about spreading democracy than they do the relationship between the great powers. So if we relationship between the great powers, that'll make the other countries, the other nations more at ease and make things work better for them. Political issues, problems in political science. There has to do with their economy, their political and their don't get a all of these things together. Context. That's not where the solution if you look at people look at ships, airplanes, submarines, about my and I think both the offensive capabilities that people have is it is extensive. Those are the George Shultz talked about. Rest his soul. 100 years old, died recently. We in the United States, one of the best things we can do is to get our fiscal house in order, and it is not in order now. Some things are going on right now with the administration of being tough on China on economic issues, but we get tough on China, and then we don't make the investments we need to make in our infrastructure and our science, our basic. You notice I didn't say investments and entitlements, but that ends up being another subject for another time to talk about it. So to wrap up a little bit, think of the C's. The C's, the alphabetic C's, the way that people are talking about the relationship of China now. Some talk about competition, cooperation, and coexistence. And the one that we ought not to be mentioning is containment, which China accuses us of trying to contain them and keep them from growing. I really don't think we're doing that, nor do I think we can do that. And most people, I think, that study this issue agree. I talked earlier about the Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell article that is competition, coexistence, confrontation, co-destruction. The C's there. Communicate, compete, cooperate, coexist. Think of the C's, you can describe all these things in that way. I'd like to close with talking and recommending, I talked about Sun Tzu earlier, the idea and his ideas about how you achieve objectives without going to war are things that you need to be seen to be willing to go to war, but not go, be strong. That is very much the way the Chinese think, and it's not such a bad way to think for us to do as we strategize for the future. All right, let me stop there. I've sucked up all our time, but we've got a few minutes left for some questions and answers, if there are any. Questions, anyway.
Am I on? Yes. Great. Just a couple, and you answered a lot as we talked before. Real quickly, how will our relationship change with the new presidential administration? Dramatic, moderate, slow?
I think it won't change abruptly. I think that certainly President Biden and his group, his administration, have continued to take a tough line economically with China. So it looks like that's not going to change too much. One thing that they have done quite soon that is I think is a very tough point is inviting the president of Taiwan to come to the United States, which is something that hasn't happened in a long time. And you can, the Taiwan-China balance, our commitment is toward a peaceful resolution It's not a peaceful reunification. It's a peaceful resolution of this issue. And so China refuses to say we won't use force. That's their right to do. But the opening up the Taiwan issue again and is something this working group would be real busy with that for a while.
Is, in your opinion, is China the key to helping us resolve the peace in North Korea and the nuclear proliferation there?
My opinion is yes. It's a short answer. And
Back to cooperation or communication.
yeah, but China will say we don't control North Korea, and the fact is, if North Korea does stuff that's China disagrees with and don't ask, China can cut off their water and oil in a heartbeat, and they seem to change. So I think they have influence there.
Another question that I had, human rights in China. Will we have any influence on human rights over there, or will we have to recognize that our countries have different philosophies?
We talked earlier about the Chinese are very proud of lifting people out of poverty, and they look at food, clothing, and shelter as human rights, whereas we look at it mostly as political and religious freedoms. The situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang is despicable, and it is something we need to keep hammering at. The Chinese will say it's our issue, not yours, but I think we can't let that go. But I think we should not have the whole relationship turn on that issue.
Yeah. China seems to support the dictators in the world. Kim in North Korea, Mugabe in Zimbabwe, al-Bashir in Sudan. Can we change this? Should we change this? Or should we let China be China and deal with them directly on how they manage their affairs?
One, I don't think we have the horsepower or to be able to change it if they want to do that. I think we can. What we need to do is demonstrate the goodness of our system, which has been hard lately. We've been struggling some. So, but I think we are not going to be able to tell China to do this, do that. We just aren't going to be able to do that.
Many companies have established business relationships with China, even at the risk of losing their intellectual properties to China. Is that a risk to our own economy?
Yes. I think if you've been reading the paper or listening to things for the last several years, the Chinese have they did not grow up with a Judeo-Christian ethic of right and wrong, fair fight type of thing. They look at whatever they can do to get ahead is okay. And I think the relationship thing that I talked about a few times impacts that. But our business, the Chinese are inveigling their way in almost any way they can to get into our businesses, get into our schools, to our research labs and things like that to get information. And they see that as that's what they do. And it does impact our businesses.
Brings me to the last question that I have. China's developed relationships with politicians, people in this country. Is it dangerous, or is it just diplomacy both ways? And in your opinion, should there be stricter review of this policy, or are the current laws and regulations fair both ways?
Of course, it makes a difference it's one of these things I feel strongly both ways. That if you're going to have communications, you're going to have relationships. I've got, or I had some friends in China. The ordinary Chinese and ordinary Americans can get along fine. But you've got to be very wary. A person in a position of any authority needs to be very wary of being played by the Chinese, because they're very good at it, and they'll tend to do that.
We've been doing it for 6,000 years.
Yes, that's right.
That's all I have, and I just want to thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks, John. I enjoyed it.